Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sophia, responsible for curating learning events for you at Spectrum. In fact, I'm in the office today, working from the office. So we are located at Duo Tower Bugis in Singapore. So we promote a learning-focused culture. So we also provide shared premium workspaces for you to work from, events and meeting spaces, solutions, and also to build a community and also to bridge the connections to expand businesses. So before I start today's webinar, so the poll says, Dr. Suman, 50% their commitment to being sustainable. That's fantastic, isn't it? So, and second, to have a deeper understanding of what being sustainable means to me or my organization. That's fantastic. All right, so before I start to introduce Dr. Suman as well, I'd like you to answer this second poll question. Give me 1 second. Okay, this is one very interesting question we want you to answer. So how many earths do you think Singapore needs to regenerate what it is using? So this will be shared by Dr. Suman later based on your answer. Okay, let's give a few more seconds. There you have it. So Dr. Suman, the answer, 50% say 5 to 7 to 6 to 7 earths, and slowly no. So balancing 1.7 to 2.7. Okay, so Dr. Suman is going to share with us later the answer to this question. So let me end the poll here. And let me welcome today's esteemed speaker. He is Dr. Suman Majumdar, a progressive senior leader engaged in designing and implementing sustainability strategies and integrated thinking practices to build capacity in corporate and non-profit organizations. He has 29 years experience in large corporations such as P&G, JSW Group, and in an Apex industry body. He currently serves as a consultant for the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Suman Majumdar for this to present to you on today's topic on raising the bar in sustainability performance. So please, audience, if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions here on the Q&A or chat. Feel free to do so. So without further ado, Dr. Suman, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. So it's a pleasure to have so many people up, rise and shining with their coffee mugs over breakfast, listening to music as we get tuned to this session. So it's a pleasure to be here, and good morning to all of you. And I do not know if there are people from other parts of the world. So good afternoon, good evening, good night to any of them. So as the topic suggests, we have here, trying to understand sustainability from an implementation point of view, whether as an individual or as a corporation or whichever organization we are wanting to implement it in. So first, we will do this in two parts: understanding what sustainability means to us, why it is so important in today's context, and then some of the examples and practices which really work in this situation. So let's start with understanding why we need to talk about sustainability. There is an apparent conflict in the understanding of various priorities, whether it's the economists, whether it's the politicians, whether it's the policy makers, or the technology and the engineers and the scientists, basically. So you have two words which are at crossroads. So we don't know which one to take up. But should that be the case, you see the two words over there, economy and environment. If you substitute the word environment with ecology, you have both the words economy and ecology starting with the letters eco, E-C-O, which is the Greek word oikos. In other words, it means the home. So if we are talking about our home, why should there be a conflict at our home? Whether it's the interrelation between the people or it's between the players uh, in that ecosystem that we are talking about. So for that matter, an organization called the Global Footprint Network did some great pioneering work, and they started looking at the details of the world, the environment, the problems, the solutions, where we are heading for, and they came up with some of the basic understanding on how we need to look at our lives. So they did a study of about almost 70 years, and they came up with these numbers. So on the x-axis, it's the year, and on the y-axis, it's the number of Earths that we require. If we were to consume and throw out stuff at the rate at which we are doing currently, where would we end up? Every ecosystem, or the world for that matter, has a certain capacity. And we are currently about 1.6. If you see in the middle, though it says 2010, the number would have gone up to about 1.68 Earths currently. So it's between 1.6, 1.7 roughly. And if we continue to do so in the next 30 years, we will be requiring more than 3 Earths to do that. And we somehow must change our lifestyle, our way of living, our way of working to bring it back to that one Earth. So that's the challenge. And how do we know where we are today? So this concept of Earth Overshoot Day was created by this Global Footprint Network, which talks about if you take any calendar year, how many days would you require to use up all the generative capacity and the ability to take up the waste that is created. So the day on which the waste generation exceeds the capacity to sustain life, there is an overshoot. It is something like you have certain amount of money in the bank in your account, and you can withdraw only X amount of dollars per year. And if you have consumed it all and you're taking now money from the next year, so you're overdrawing your account. So that is what is the Earth Overshoot Day. And this is what has been in the last 50 years. The green color indicates everything is within the Earth's capacity. And the red lines indicate the dates on which that capacity was exceeded and by how much. So if you see, there is a gradual increase in the pace at which we have overutilized the Earth's capacity. And we are currently already into the month of August. So what that means is the later it comes, that means later as in from the top to bottom. So we are closer towards December, it's good. But now we have already reached, like I said, August. And in this year, it is expected to reach on July 29th. That means on July 29th, the Earth would have consumed everything within its capacity for the year 2021. And from July 30th onwards, we are actually into the quota for 2022. So that's an alarming situation. We have already lost 5 months of the year at the way we are growing. If you see 2020, there is a slight dip. That's largely because of the pandemic. Many economic activities had to be curtailed. But then there is a rebound that is happening now. So which is why we are into July already in this year. But let's take a closer look at some of these issues. And countries have been ranked. The countries which have got the best biocapacity reserve, or it's like a percentage where they are well into doing what they have got to be doing to maintain their capacity. The top 11 countries in the world are over here. So even a country like Brazil ranks 11. So everything green is good, but the ones higher up in the table, it's better. So they are doing better than many other countries. And that is the case over here when we have this French Guyana doing almost 4,000% more than what their ability to grow is. So it's a good thing. On the other side, we've got those countries which have actually exceeded, and by how much percentage? So if you look at the top 11 countries, can you take a guess which is the top of that list? Top would mean actually doing very badly. That's Singapore. So we are actually crossing that limit or that ability by almost 10,500 percentage points. Till about 3 years ago, many of the countries in the Gulf were actually leading that list, but it has increasingly shifted to the other countries. And if you notice, all of these countries are extremely small in size. They have got very limited resources apart from whatever that their economy lives on. For example, the ones in the Gulf, they depend on the oil, whereas the others, they depend on everything being imported. So that footprint is very high. For a country like Singapore, even basic requirements like water and energy also gets imported. So besides the food, so that is where the government has created their own Ministry of Sustainability and Environment to look at some of these issues. And you hear all about the vision for 2050, how the country is trying to come out of all of these problems. Let's look at Singapore closer. Why we have such a problem? So you see the graph where you have a green line which is practically crawling along the x-axis, and you've got the red curve which is fairly high. What those colors indicate is explained on the left side, where it's like a per capita thing. So while you've got the GDP per capita is almost 58,000, and the population is close to 5.8 million. So if you divide all the biocapacity by the population, you get the per capita value, which is very close to zero actually. So there is no additional biocapacity we are able to have because the population is increasing. That means the pressure on the ecosystem is going to go up as we go by, and that's the challenge. Whereas the red line talks about how more and more negative we are becoming. So as more and more people live here in the lifestyle that we are creating more waste. We are consuming more energy. We are creating more emissions. So these are the problems that we have. So if you look at the green value, it's about 0.1 global hectares. Global hectares is actually looking at how many hectares of land would be required to sustain that life. And the ecological footprint per capita global hectares talks about how many hectares of land you would actually require to take up and absorb and assimilate all the waste each person is creating. So if you have these two values, and if you see the difference, we are at negative 5.8. That means we don't have the land, but we are exceeding the capacity of the land. And at this rate, we will be actually requiring about 3.7 to 3.8 Earths, which was the poll question 2, which was shown at the beginning of the webinar today. So this is where we are. So as people residing in this country, we have to take care, and it's the same story for each of the countries. So they need to look at what is their footprint currently and what can be done to come out of that problem situation. So the next part here is trying to talk about what are the new concepts that have come up in the last maybe 3 decades or so. So if you look at the understanding of the word sustainability, some people link it with the business and their profits. So it's called the triple bottom line, where it refers to the bottom line calculations and estimates for economic, environment, and social dimensions of the organization. It was simplistically called profit, people, and planet by the company named Shell several years ago. And so these are all very similar. You also have more expressions coming in today's context, like ESG, environmental social governance, which is typically an investor or a financial institution slant to that same expression. Then you've got the environment cluster, where words like eco-friendly, green economy, waste minimization, cleaner production, all of these, and there are many more. I just gave some over here as a sample. So these have also become very common in today's speeches, in today's articles, in whoever makes a presentation somewhere. And then there is a slightly more advanced and technical understanding of the situation where people try to look at the life cycle of everything that is used by human beings today. It is based on the understanding that everything has an origin and everything has a close. So that is how that cradle to grave concept was initially understood. But then as the understanding deepened and maturity increased, people started to say that because of the footprint and the life cycle, the footprint of every activity and every production and every item that we use, nothing should be wasted. So one should find a new use for something which we cannot use in a certain context. So there is a new life given, which is why cradle to cradle. And there will be many more expressions as we come along in the days to come. That brings us to a subject called the industrial ecology, where if you recall, the first slide I had shown that, economy and ecology, the crossroads, the two signs at crossroads. So we have to look at how industry and business also can help in reducing their footprint and overall make the world go back to a single earth rather than the multiple earths which are required. The other concept I will talk about, and which is quite popular today, which is getting popular today, is circular economy. Not all of these are understood, or they are understood differently by different backgrounds of people. So let's try to look at some examples and a deeper understanding of these two concepts. So let's start with industrial ecology. So the concept became really famous about 35 years ago by the small town called Kalundborg in Denmark. And the concept here was refined, and about a few years ago, it was made into a really intellectual property thing. So they called it Kalundborg Symbiosis, and they have also made a logo for it, where everything is interconnected. So it's a closed loop. That is how the logo is interpreted. And I will also talk about my own experience before I moved to Singapore about 2.5 years ago, when I was the Chief Sustainability Officer for this JSW group. So it's a diverse conglomerate into the sectors that are mentioned on the screen. And just for making people aware, JSW Steel is India's biggest steel company. It's bigger than many other more prominent names that you might have heard of. And there is also energy, which is having not only the thermal power plants, but also the hydro, and now also getting into solar. Infrastructure, which deals with largely the ports that are needed for the import and export of goods. And you've got cement. So I'll explain more of this in the example that we in a few minutes. But let's look at Kalundborg. So this concept became really famous, like I said, initially from this city. And there are a few other actors in this drama that we are trying to show here. There is a power plant, there is an acid plant, there is also a gypsum board plant, the refinery, there is also this pharma company, Novo Nordisk, also into agrochemicals. There is this lake which provides water to all the players over here, including the city. Obviously, there are farms and there are fish farms being on the coast, and so it's a rich source of revenue and food for the people and for export purposes from Denmark. So let's look at the interplay between not only the goods and products of each of those operations, but also the waste streams, which goes from one to the other. So if you see from the left side, you've got the lake, which provides the water to the refinery, power plant, and to Novo, and obviously to the city as well. But then this is just an oversimplified way of showing how it began, 30 years ago when this concept was being created. So you can see the various items which are apparently a waste for one of the players is becoming an input or a resource for the other players. So that is how this concept became to be known or about waste is actually a misnomer. It's a resource out of place. If I cannot find a use, I don't just chuck it away. I try to find somebody who can use it in whichever way they want. So every item, once it enters the economic loop, it continues to stay in the economic loop. The ownership and the change of hands can take place, but it stays in the economic loop. That is what it is being shown over here. And if you take an updated version, I took this from their site about a couple of days ago. So you got many more players now, and this concept has become more refined. So if you go to the website, you will actually be able to see a moving figure. It's an animated figure there. And you've got the three colors of the lines which interconnect the players: energy, water, materials by the color code that is indicated. And for each stream which is numbered, there is a mention of what is that material and how much is the quantity, and what goes on between each of the players. So this is actually a very fascinating understanding of a concept where it's a close knit. There is deep understanding between the players, and there are lots of benefits and gains because of this relationship, the symbiotic relationship, where each one feeds off the other. And they've also estimated the gains and the benefits out of each of these. Otherwise, this concept will be a failure. So every year, there is a huge amount of money that is saved, a big quantity of materials. Considering the size of that town, that's 87,000 tons is fairly big. And there is also a significant reduction in the CO2 emissions, how much of water gets conserved, and the amount of energy that is saved. Energy saved because it is energy avoided, because they're trying to use, reuse the different forms of energy from one player to the other. And the number of players are increasing as more and more organizations come into play. So you've got all of these, 13 organizations or entities which are now relating to each other. If I go to look at, this concept and take it forward to the next concept of the circular economy, many of you might have heard of this name called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. They are the ones who really popularized, and they've got a lot of resources on the web as well. And they have this very famous butterfly diagram where you have traditionally a linear economy, and compared to that, we have a circular economy concept which is being promoted. When they say circular, there are two aspects or the two sides of that coin. So on the image that you see on the screen, on the left side, you have what is called the biological part, and the right side, you've got the technical part. And there are circles within circles. So if you see traditionally what has been, it's a linear, which is in the center from top to bottom. So you've got the energy, and you've got the inputs, and you've got the manufacturer, you've got the bigger manufacturer, and then it goes to the service provider, and then it goes to the consumer or the user, depending on what is the material or the object being used. And it goes, whatever can be recovered, it goes to the landfill, what cannot be recovered. So that's been the linear. But now they have started to look at circles, where it goes back to from the user or the consumer point. If you see on the left side, there is something which the consumer themselves reuse, or there is some kind of extraction, there is some kind of further processing, and there are other uses of the material which would have otherwise been a waste or have ended up in the landfill, some of it which is restored. So this is using the natural ecological processes on the left side, which is why it's called the biocycles. So it stays within the living world, and then it ultimately goes also to the farms and therefore the food chains and the agriculture and the harvesting, and it comes back to the consumer. On the right side, you have various types of levels and degrees of the circles over here. If it is directly something which has gone spoiled or faulty, you can repair it and you can use it back again. Sometimes it can go to other players, it can be given to others, and that's how it is the second one. And then you've got concepts like the refurbish or the remanufacture. And the biggest one is the recycle, when it goes back to the original manufacturer, the OEM. So that's the largest cycle, and it goes to the original manufacturer and you get the flow through again. Beyond user and consumer, you have things called energy recovery, which means either they are burned, or there are other ways in which the energy is extracted from the materials which are no longer usable, and all the residues finally end up in the landfill, and that has to be kept minimum. And that is something which will be part of the next example which I am going to show you, how to ensure that nothing goes to the landfills. Even in Singapore, you got a separate island called Semakau, where all the stuff ends up over there. And there are various attempts by the government here to minimize quantity of materials which are ending up over there, because it's a finite place and you cannot have perpetual dumping of materials on that. So let's look at the example from the JSW group, where you've got the JSW steel, as you can see over here. I also mentioned the infrastructure, which is the ports. So a lot of the stuff which is used in making steel is imported or transported from various parts of the country and the world. So you've got the ports serving as the channels for basic ingredients for making steel, iron ore, for example, and then you've got coal. And that there is the other arm of the business, which is called the JSW Energy. So I mentioned to you thermal power plants. So part of that coal also goes to the energy. So it's imported together and then distributed between the various business verticals across the different locations in the country. So when steel is manufactured, there are lots of these waste gases which are generated, and they are at high temperature and they have combustible materials in them, constituents. So traditionally, earlier, historically, they had been released to the atmosphere. But then as environmental pressures became stronger, companies also became smarter, and they started to use those gases into generating energy. So for example, JSW Steel produces about 300 megawatts of power purely on the waste gases from the steel sector within the businesses. So wherever there is a steel manufacturing location, you also have coexisting the JSW Energy site, which is able to handle those waste gases and generate the energy, and then give back to the steel company the energy which is needed to run the steel. There's also a new entrant called the JSW Cement Company. Now, this is probably the first example in the world where a steel company has set up a cement company to take care of the wastes. Two kinds of wastes, apart from the ones that I mentioned earlier about the waste gases, are there in the steel company. The biggest one is the slag. So there is slag from the blast furnaces. Blast furnaces is the part where iron ore is converted to iron. And then there is a second stage where the iron is converted to steel. So there you have another kind of slag. Both those slags are otherwise dumped in traditional cases. And you have huge mountains of slag wherever there has been steel. So slag consists of materials which are non-metallous, non-ferrous, and it cannot be used for in the metals refining processes. So what happens is that slag is used to make cement. The slag is granulated and made. So instead of limestone, you can actually have slag there in the cement manufacture. The other element of the cement manufacture is based on the ash which comes from burning of the coal. So you have coal burnt in the furnaces in the steel company as well as from the energy company. So you've got fly ash, you've got bottom ash, all of that. Both of these streams end up in the cement manufacture. So that's green cement that we are actually talking about. And if you look at what happens to that cement, that green cement, it is used. So you also take the energy from the energy company in the cement making. Both steel and cement operations are resource intensive, emissions intensive. And that cement is used to manufacture or construct the ports that are there. So it's a very tightly knit cycle over here. And then those ports are also used to export the steel to other geographies. And there is also steel which is sold in the domestic market in India, energy and cement which are also sold in the domestic markets, apart from those which are exported through those ports above, right? So this is a simplified version of what you saw similar to Kallenberg. And this is the story. And it's not just the operations and the manufacturing sites. There is also the headquarters of the JSW Group. So if you see, this building is also a platinum rated green building by the Green Buildings Council. And I used to sit in this building as the person in the sustainability department. And this building has several features, not only from the specific energy consumption or the water. So you've got waterless toilets and all that water is treated. You've got solar panels on the terrace and so many others. The construction material itself has been based on wastes from other sectors. For example, fly ash and fly ash based cement, and all of the materials used are having high reflective capacity. So because of that, the building doesn't get heated up as much as a conventional building. And the air conditioning load is almost 23% lower than a conventional building of that size, and so on and so forth. So this is one part of the story. And if I have time, can I show a video, Sophia? You can tell me.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Suman.
It's thank you. It's part of a smaller okay, it's a video. I'm not going to show the entire 21 minutes. The name of this is called The Story of Stuff, and you can look it up on YouTube. It's a very fascinating understanding and depiction of the problems that we just covered in the last few slides. And though it's based largely on the US, it's applicable to the rest of the world. And many of these concepts were shown almost 20 years ago. They're still very valid. And we have to look at understanding how the linear economy versus the circular economy works, and also the kinds of consumption patterns that we've got into. Using and throwing this becomes so convenient that we don't bother, which is what is leading up to creating or needing 3.7 Earths for Singapore.
Wondering about that, so I looked it up. What the textbook said is that stuff moves through a system from extraction to production to distribution to consumption to disposal. All together, it's called the materials economy. Well, I looked into it a little bit more. In fact, I spent 10 years traveling the world, tracking where our stuff comes from and where it goes. And you know what I found out? That is not the whole story. There is a lot missing from this explanation. For one thing, this system looks like it's fine. No problem. But the truth is, it's a system in crisis. The reason it's a system in crisis is it's a linear system and we live on a finite planet. And you cannot run a linear system on a finite planet indefinitely. Every step along the way, this system is interacting with the real world. In real life, it's not happening on a blank white page. It's interacting with societies, cultures, economies, the environment. And all along the way, it's bumping up against limits. Limits we don't see here because the diagram is incomplete. So let's go back through. Let's fill in some of the blanks and see what's missing. Well, one of the most important things that's missing is people. Yes, people. People live and work all along this system. And some people in this system matter a little more than others. Some have a little more say. Who are they? Well, let's start with the government. Now, my friends tell me I should use a tank to symbolize the government, and that's true in many countries and increasingly in our own. After all, more than 50% of our federal tax money is now going to the military. But I'm using a person to symbolize the government because I hold true to the vision and values the government should be of the people, by the people, for the people. It's the government's job to watch out for us, to take care of us. That's their job. Then along came the corporation. Now, the reason the corporation looks bigger than the government is that the corporation is bigger than the government. Of the 100 largest economies on Earth now, 51 are corporations. And as the corporation has grown in size and power, we've seen a little change in the government, where they're a little more concerned in making sure everything's working out for those guys than for us. Okay, so let's see what else is missing from this picture. We'll start with extraction, which is a fancy word for natural resource exploitation, which is a fancy word for trashing the planet. What this looks like is we chop down the trees, we blow up mountains to get the metals inside, we use up all the water, and we wipe out the animals. So here, we are running up against our first limit. We are running out of resources. We are using too much stuff. Now, I know this can be hard to hear, but it's the truth, so we've got to deal with it. In the past 3 decades alone, 1/3 of the planet's natural resource base has been consumed. Gone. We are cutting and mining and hauling, trashing the place so fast that we're undermining the planet's very ability for people to live here. Where I live, in the United States, we have less than 4% of our original forests left. 40% of the waterways has become undrinkable. And our problem is not just that we're using too much stuff, but we're using more than our share. We have 5% of the world's population, but we're using 30% of the world's resources and creating 30% of the world's waste. If everybody consumed at US rates, we would need 3 to 5 planets. So what? We've only got 1. So my country's response to this limitation is simply to go take somebody else's. This is the third world, which some would say is another word for our stuff that somehow got on somebody else's land. So what does that look like? The same thing, trashing the place. 75% of global fisheries now are fished at or beyond capacity. 80% of the planet's original forests are gone. In the Amazon alone, we're losing 2,000 trees a minute. That is 7 football fields a minute. And what about the people who live here? Well, according to these guys, they don't own these resources, even if they've been living there for generations. They don't own the means of production, and they're not buying a lot of stuff. And in this system, if you don't own or buy a lot of stuff, you don't have value. So next, the materials move to production. And what happens there is we use energy to mix toxic chemicals in with the natural resources to make toxic contaminated products. There are over 100,000 synthetic chemicals in use in commerce today. Only a handful of them have even been tested for health impacts. None have been tested for synergistic health impacts. That means when they interact with all the other chemicals we're exposed to every day. So we don't know the full impact on health and the environment of all these toxic chemicals, but we do know one thing. Toxics in, toxics out. As long as we keep putting toxics into our industrial production systems, we're going to keep getting toxics in the stuff that we bring into our homes and workplaces and schools, and our bodies. Like BFRs, brominated flame retardants, they're a chemical that make things more fireproof, but they are super toxic. They're a neurotoxin. That means toxic to the brain. What are we even doing using a chemical like this? Yet we put it in our computers, our appliances, couches, mattresses, even some pillows. In fact, we take our pillows, we douse them in a neurotoxin, and we bring them home and put our heads on them for 8 hours a night to sleep. Now, I don't know, but it seems to me in this country with so much potential, we could think of a better way to stop our heads from catching on fire at night. That these toxics build up the food chain and concentrate in our bodies? Do you know what is the food at the top of the food chain with the highest level of many toxic contaminants? Human breast milk. That means that we've reached a point where the smallest members of our societies, our babies, are getting the highest lifetime dose of toxic chemicals from breastfeeding from their mothers. Is that not an incredible violation? Breastfeeding must be the most fundamental human act of nurturing. It should be sacred and safe. Now, breastfeeding is still best, and mothers should definitely keep breastfeeding, but we should protect it. They should protect it. I thought they were looking out for us. And of course, the people who bear the biggest brunt of these toxic chemicals are the factory workers, many of whom are women of reproductive age. They're working with reproductive toxins, carcinogens, and more. Now, I ask you, what kind of woman of reproductive age would work in a job exposed to reproductive toxins, except for a woman with no other option?
I think I'll stop now, Sophia, and get back to the slides.
Sure, thank you.
So that was indeed actually having many lessons to convey. And I would urge you all to take a look at that video at leisure and see the different messages that are brought out over there. It was halfway only when we had to stop because we cannot show the full thing here. But then I would really like you all to use this opportunity to look up some of those resources that have been mentioned, because after all, my intention was to only stimulate some new thoughts and thinking in your minds and look at the way you can make a difference to your own families, to your friends' circles, to the organizations where you work. And the bigger picture is to make a difference in the world. And we all have to do our own bit, and we cannot depend on the others to do everything. So I think I will stop now, and I will leave you all with the quote from a person who has been the world's first person to walk across both the North Pole and the South Pole, Robert Swan, and where he says, it's only fair that all of us contribute to that common cause for our own survival and for the survival of the generations to come. And it's not good if we think someone else will do it. It's not my problem. And he has been a pioneer in many ways. The first trip he did to the South Pole, he measured his footprint in terms of the environmental wastes that he was creating. So the second one he did to the North Pole, he made it completely reusable and renewable sources of energy for all his needs in that travel. And this is the kind of challenge that he faced, face covered with ice and snow, trying to show that if we are willing to fight it out, we can achieve even what seemed impossible a few years ago. And the last trip that he made, I think a little over a year ago, is before this pandemic started, is when he tried to do a second time to the North Pole. And he had a broken hip. And the message that he was trying to convey to the others is, by the year 2041, we should be achieving the Paris Agreement, that 1.5 degree temperature increase. If we do not achieve it by this year, the world is doomed. So it's high time that we all take our roles very seriously and try to make a meaningful difference. So thank you very much for your patience and hearing. I'll be happy to take on your reactions and questions, if any. Sophia, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Suman. Suman, would you like to stop share, and then we'll go into the Q&A session now. Right. So please, audience, feel free to drop your questions here. We have some questions through as well. So anonymous Tenny, thank you for this question. Interesting data. Would love to know how to quantify the Earth biocapacity for future research.
It's actually simple. I mean, I cannot tell it to you now in 30 seconds. So I would suggest you go up to that site, Global Footprint Network. And I had shown a graph. There was a link also at the bottom, but you can just Google it. So they show exact methodology, not only for every country and also for every year. So there are time series analysis done for the data, the exact methods of calculations, what all they have considered, and what is the source of some of those assumptions they have made and arrived at those figures. In fact, this concept has become so strong that there are about 7 or 8 countries who use this data to assess their own sustainability goals as a nation. So even those names of those countries are there on that website. It's really fascinating. I would really urge you to go on that.
Thank you. So, Michael, thank you for your questions as well. Yes, recording will be available after the session. So before I forget, there was a question, Zainal raised your hand. Zainal, feel free to drop your question onto the Q&A window here. All right. And from Anonymous as well, how to draw a line between industrial ecology, circular economy, cradle to cradle? Is there any components to clearly differentiate them?
Well, I think don't get confused and lost in the way something is defined. It's important to understand, it's a question of interrelations. All of them talk about interrelations. They are actually very similar fundamentally, and they are absolutely the same. It's just that the application or the orientation is slightly different. Let me explain to you. When you talk of industrial ecology, it's obviously looking at businesses more in the manufacturing sector. So, so they are where there is consumption of resources, water, energy, input materials for that manufacturing, and also they are generating wastes. So of various kinds, solid, liquid, gaseous, and combination, hazardous, non-hazardous. So many of these kinds of materials coming in and going out and wasted. So trying to see how some other entity can find a use for something which I cannot use. That is all about industrial ecology. Circular economy is a much bigger picture. It can be at the national level, it can be at the international level, it can be at the local level. And it is also applicable at the organizational level. But obviously, it's not a single player again. As the term ecology, economy I mentioned, the Greek root word oikos is home. So all the residents and the players in the home are critical over here. It is more for policymakers and to give direction, understanding the way the direction has to be given to the entities or the organizations. So circular economy helps to understand, and there are sector-specific guidelines as well for textiles, for chemicals, for whatever, for food, for agriculture. So all of these have got their guidelines. It may not necessarily be restricted to industry. So there are other players as well. Cradle to cradle is similar again to industrial ecology and circular economy in the sense nothing has to have a debt. Anything which enters the material loop has to stay in the material loop one way or the other. So that is what it is. It can be, I might find ways to use it myself. Like you've got expressions like extended producer responsibility. So which is trying to push manufacturers to pick up the waste from the consumers and reprocess, recycle, reuse it in some way so that it doesn't end up in the landfills. So these are all various shades of the same, I would say, entity, really similar, but then the idea is nothing is wasted ever.
Great, thank you, Dr. Suman. Keep the questions coming through. So Michael, thank you for your question here. How can fintech companies use technologies to incorporate sustainability for their clients?
Okay, so obviously fintech companies are a catalyst, or they are the lever which is used to nudge organizations into looking at different newer technologies, different applications, different uses. So when something is being followed or developed by some organization somewhere and it has got a proven track record of the benefits and the gains, how can they talk about their clients after all, it's a service provider. Fintech is providing service to their clients. The clients have to be nudged into taking up those clean technologies, those new technologies, the total cost of ownership, the life cycle assessment approaches in their own cases. So the fintech companies themselves can also adopt many aspects of these sustainable operations. For example, they depend a lot on computing abilities. So they require huge networks of computers. And obviously, when you talk of computers and networks, you have data servers. And large data servers would mean large energy requirements to run them, to do the cooling operations. So, and so on and so forth. So you get the drift. There are so many aspects for even a service sector company like the fintech and the IT firms and the financial institutions, and how they can nudge their clients into taking up those clean approaches.
Great, thank you, Dr. Suman. So on this note as well, basically, we've heard about Chief Technology Officer, heard about Chief Digital Officer, Transformation Officer, and now we hear a lot about Chief Sustainability Officer that's being assumed into an organization. So what is typically his role, his or her role in that organization?
Yeah, so, luckily I was fortunate of having been one, in a large diversified conglomerate before I moved to JSW Group. So from that experience, it's not just theory that I can talk about. So this person has the prime responsibility of looking out for the business, looking at newer things happening, good practices happening in different parts of the world, in different sectors, and how they can be adopted and applied and used within that organization for that triple bottom line. It has not only got to satisfy the shareholders and the profits from the economic activities, but also minimizing environmental damage and maximizing social benefits because of that. So that understanding, and then making the people within the organization, the decision makers internal, them to understand. So the CSO, I had to convince the board to look at newer ways and rather than the traditional ones. It takes a lot of data and examples and real life examples to show that this is not a figment of the imagination, but it is real. And there are benefits to it because investors and ESG and the credit rating agencies, they all give importance to these cleaner ways of operating and taking care of the responsibility. And that also helps to convince the government that this organization is a responsible corporate citizen. And it opens up newer channels of communication, access to capital, opportunities for new hires. People consider this good organizations to come and work for, and there are many more such benefits. So conveying all of these benefits in a combined package and also communicating to the external world, all these are different roles of a CSO.
Right, and also there's a framework that an organization can commit to as well, such as the UN SDGs, which leads me to this next question. Thanks for your question, Wei Liang. Is there a need for a concerted sustainability assessment framework across governments and businesses? This is the first part of his question, Dr. Suman.
Yeah, so there is definitely a need to have a structured approach. It cannot be ad hoc, it cannot be random, it cannot be based on whims and fancies. One person in the senior management feels that this is the flavor of the day. So the next 6 months we'll be doing only renewables, and the next 6 months we'll be doing waste minimization. It's not that kind of an approach, patchwork. It's got to be a structured approach. It doesn't matter which framework you use. You can make your own framework based on your understanding of the various options that are available and the ones that are most applicable and acceptable within the organization. Something which can work, because as a CSO or any person who is trying to drive this across the organization needs to understand where the capacity within the organization is, how much of ability to absorb and understand is there. If not, do we need to get external help, either a consultant or a new hire? And how much of resources are required? And how much difference will it take to achieve the results and the benefits? So for all of these, unless you have a framework, you cannot measure. And unless you can measure, you cannot manage. So the Plan, Do, Check, Act has to be there following a certain framework. Doesn't matter, GRI, SDG, Global Compact, there are so many more that are available.
Right. Okay. So as you said, probably engage a professional to, go through a specific framework that's recommended for the businesses to follow as well. Okay. So from that question, Dhiren, thanks for your comments here on the chat. Waste matter of perspective, it is generally subjective. A sustainability model or framework showing vectors across industries and processes can dramatically accelerate awareness, adoption for different nations and ecosystems. Do you agree? And can you elaborate?
It's in the chat, did you say?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, it's in the chat.
Okay.
See the chat from Dhiren?
Yeah. I read that. Yeah, so I very much agree. And there are, like I said, there are factors which can hugely accelerate. And the person who is leading these initiatives in the organization needs to have an understanding of that appetite, that maturity, that ability within the organization. And also understand the other side, the external part, which are the technologies, what are the, synergistic applications which are available, who else can help us do that, understanding the stakeholders around us who will facilitate adoption of these technologies within the organization, and what factors can influence. So do I have to spend a lot of effort training a lot of people, or is it something which a limited number of people, for example, can push through, or something which is user friendly for all employees to adopt? So the understanding of the entire gamut of issues and making a priority list. So what is typically called in the sustainability lingo called materiality. So that materiality analysis also is part of that structured framework which needs to be done. If you really want to achieve, it would take 2 to 3 years to really reach the full benefits. But then one has to start and keep learning, not only internally assessing, and also learning from others, the examples and the experiences of other companies. So it's a knowledge which is easy to give, but very difficult to adopt. And that is the challenge. So all the vectors that one can think of, which will push and nudge organizations to adopting, are always welcome.
Great, thank you, Dr. Suman. Okay, so this last question I suggest from Anonymous, I'd suggest that we'll take it offline with Dr. Suman.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll share this with him offline. So at the same time, if you have any further questions, feel free to drop on the chat or the Q&A. Otherwise, what I'll do is I'll drop the feedback link over here. Okay, can everyone see? Feel free to fill up the feedback over there. And what I'd like to do is also to share with you Dr. Suman's profile on LinkedIn, and then that particular question that you have from the anonymous attendee, feel free to reach out to Dr. Suman via his LinkedIn or his email address, or I'll be happy to bridge the connection. So then at the same time, I'd like to also thank the audience. So join us for our next July webinars coming up. So practically what you could do is to follow us on LinkedIn. Let me share our LinkedIn page. So we will post information on our upcoming events here as well. So Dr. Suman, it has been a wonderful session. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot, likewise, I think for the audience as well. Any tips or messages that you want to share with the audience before we go?
So thank you. It's been a pleasure. The only thing I would say, it's never too late. So already there is so much of problems and damage. What can I do as a single person, as an individual? that is not something we should think of. One can always start and take along as many people, our friends, our relatives, our families, our organizations, our departments, our colleagues, and so on and so forth. So push each of them, push ourselves to take the right steps based on the understanding that we have. So we should not be selfish. We have to look for the future as well. So if today we are creating the problems, tomorrow it's going to get worse. And there are people who are putting their lives at risk trying to make that understanding, like we saw Robert Swan, the last slide that I had shown. So we must look at the future generations as well.
Thank you, Dr. Suman. I think it's an important message for us to bring home, basically for ourselves, and most importantly, for the generations to come, our kids, our nephews, our future next generation. Okay, so if you have no questions here, feel free to reach out to us if any questions. And my name is Sophia, I'm signing off. Thank you, Dr. Suman, for a wonderful session today. So let's catch up again.
Sure, thank you.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye.